A hidden civil war nearly shattered the Knights Templar from within. Behind their legendary image of unity and power, the order was torn apart by secret conflicts and bitter rivalries. By the end of this story, you will understand the true human cost of their internal struggle and how it set the stage for their shocking downfall. We will uncover the clandestine meetings where brother turned against brother and explore the forbidden doctrines that fueled suspicion. What does it take for a band of brothers sworn to absolute loyalty to begin questioning everything they once held sacred? The order began with just 9 men. They were not the legendary bankers or the powerful landowners history would later remember. In the year 1119, in the harsh aftermath of the First Crusade, these 9 knights took a solemn vow. Their mission was breathtakingly simple, yet incredibly dangerous. They pledged to protect the Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, a journey fraught with bandits and peril at every turn. Imagine these early brothers, clad in simple robes, their lives defined not by wealth or political influence, but by a shared, selfless purpose. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. Their bond was forged in the fire of shared hardship, a brotherhood built on mutual reliance and sacrifice under the relentless Jerusalem sun. This unity was their greatest strength, codified in a strict set of regulations known as the Latin Rule. This rule dictated every aspect of their lives, from the prayers they recited to the clothes they wore and the food they shared. It was a life of radical austerity, where no man held personal wealth and all were equal in their devotion to a single sacred cause. This was the powerful glue that held the fledgling order together, a bond that seemed unbreakable. But it is this very foundation of absolute unity that makes their coming internal strife so shocking and profound. That sacred vow of poverty began to feel like a distant memory. The same success born from their discipline and unity started to pull them in opposite directions. A quiet but profound schism opened within the order, a clash between 2 irreconcilable visions for the future. On one side stood the traditionalist knights, the men who still saw themselves as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. Their world was one of prayer, martial training, and the tangible dangers of the battlefield. They believed the order's soul resided in its swords, in the direct protection of pilgrims and the defense of the Holy Land. For them, the original Latin rule was not just a guideline, it was their sacred identity. Yet standing beside them was a new kind of brother, one who wielded a quill instead of a sword. These were the administrator brothers, the men who managed the order's vast and growing estates across Europe, who navigated the complex world of international finance and royal politics. They saw a different kind of warfare, one fought with contracts and coin, arguing that true power and longevity for the order depended on this economic strength. Can you see the conflict brewing? The knight in the deserts of the Holy Land, risking his life daily, might receive a letter from a brother in Paris, not requesting more soldiers, but demanding a detailed accounting of local expenses. The warrior saw this as a betrayal of their core mission, a descent into materialism. The administrator saw it as essential pragmatism, the only way to fund the very wars the knights were fighting. This was not a petty squabble. It was a fundamental disagreement over the soul of the Templar enterprise, a cold war between the sword and the ledger book. This philosophical divide created an undercurrent of resentment that would fester for decades, proving that sometimes the greatest threats come not from external enemies, but from the internal contradictions born of your own success. The ledger book was winning, and then the Holy Land itself was lost. In the year 1291, the city of Acre, the final great fortress of the Crusader states, fell to a relentless Mamluk siege. This was not just a military defeat, it was a cataclysm that ripped the very ground from beneath the Knights Templar. Their entire reason for being, their sacred purpose to protect pilgrims and hold the Holy Land, evaporated in the smoke and rubble. Imagine the shockwave that rippled through the order, from the desperate survivors on the Cypriot shores to the stunned brothers in their preceptories across Europe. The bedrock of their identity had crumbled. In the wake of this disaster, a fierce and fundamental debate erupted at the highest levels of leadership. The question was simple, yet it threatened to tear them apart. What were the Templars without a holy land to defend? One faction, led primarily by the French branch of the order, argued for a total commitment to a new crusade. They believed their honor and their sacred vows demanded a relentless focus on recapturing Jerusalem. To them, abandoning the fight was to abandon their very soul. They saw the vast European estates not as a home, but as a treasury to be emptied for one great, final military effort. Yet another powerful voice emerged, often from the English Templars and other outlying provinces. They advocated for a radical shift in strategy. They argued that the age of crusading was over, that pouring more men and money into a lost cause was a path to utter ruin. Instead, they proposed the order should consolidate its power in Europe, accept a more permanent role as bankers and landlords, and secure its future through political and economic influence. This was no longer a quiet philosophical divide between sword and ledger. This was a loud, desperate schism over the order's survival. The French Templar saw the English position as a cowardly betrayal of their founding oath. The English Templar saw the French obsession as a suicidal fantasy that would bankrupt them all. This internal conflict brought the order to a critical crossroads, paralyzed by a question for which their ancient rule had no answer. They were a military order with no war to fight, a brotherhood united by a purpose that had just vanished from the map. Into this leadership vacuum stepped two men who embodied the order's deep divisions. The aging Grand Master, Guillaume de Beaujeu, had witnessed the fall of Acre firsthand. He was a pragmatist to his core, a man who believed that survival in a hostile world sometimes required compromise. He had engaged in diplomacy, even forming temporary alliances with Muslim powers, a move that traditionalist knights viewed not as strategy but as sacrilege. To them, de Beaujeu's actions betrayed the crusading spirit itself. His death during the final defense of Acre left his faction leaderless and his policies branded by some as failure. The stage was set for a dramatic reversal. Years later, Jacques de Molay would rise to the Grand Mastership, and he represented everything de Beaujeu's supporters had opposed. De Molay was a charismatic and unyielding traditionalist, a warrior who spoke passionately of a great new crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. He saw de Beaujeu's pragmatism as a dangerous deviation from their sacred path. Under de Molay, the militant voice that had been silenced by the fall of Acre found its champion once more. This was not merely a difference of opinion. It was a fundamental clash of legacies. De Molay actively worked to dismantle the administrative and diplomatic networks that de Beaujeu had cultivated, viewing them as a corrupting influence. In response, the loyalists of the old Grand Master, many of whom still held key positions in the order's vast European apparatus, grew deeply distrustful of de Molay's militant ambitions. They saw his crusading zeal as a reckless fantasy that would drain the order's wealth and provoke powerful enemies. Imagine the scene at a Templar chapter meeting. A seasoned administrator, a man who had served de Beaujeu, would present a detailed report on the order's financial health, arguing for caution. De Molay and his inner circle of knights would dismiss such concerns, prioritizing military preparation above all else. This created a fractured command structure where the left hand no longer trusted the right. The Order's central leadership, which should have been a source of unified direction, became a house divided, with one faction actively undermining the vision of the other. How could such an organization present a strong front to the outside world when its own leaders were perpetually at war? This internal power struggle left the Templars dangerously vulnerable, their unity shattered just when they needed it most. The Order's treasury was not merely a collection of coins, it was a source of bitter division. For the Knight brothers stationed in the east, the true treasure was the blood spilled on the sands of the Holy Land. Their world was one of sacrifice, of constant vigilance against a formidable enemy, a life lived in fulfillment of their sacred oath. But back in the sprawling preceptories of Paris and London, a different kind of battle was being waged. There, the Treasurer brothers, men who had perhaps never drawn a sword in anger, managed an empire of assets. They collected tithes, administered vast farmlands, and orchestrated complex loans to kings and nobles. Their power was immense, built on the practical necessity of funding a holy war, but it created a deep and growing resentment. A warrior risking his life for a cause might receive a sternly worded letter from a brother he had never met, demanding to know why the expenses for his garrison's horses had exceeded the quarterly allowance. To the knight, this felt like a profound betrayal. His sacrifice was being measured in silver pennies by a man safe behind a desk 1,000 miles away. He saw the treasurer's work not as support, but as a corrupting influence, a slow drift from their founding vow of poverty into the sin of usury. The very act of lending money at interest, even to fund their own operations, was seen by many as a stain on their spiritual purity. Were they still the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, or had they become servants of gold, their spiritual heart replaced by a calculating ledger? This economic rift cut to the core of their identity, creating an invisible wall within the brotherhood where mutual reliance was slowly poisoned by mutual suspicion. That growing suspicion found its most explosive fuel in the shadows of the initiation ceremony. When a new man sought to join the brotherhood, he was taken into a private room, away from prying eyes, to swear his sacred vows. This secretive process, intended to bind the order together with unbreakable oaths, would later be twisted into the very weapon that destroyed it. The official Latin rule outlined a straightforward rite, but whispers persisted of other practices, rituals that may have developed differently in isolated preceptories far from the order's central authority. Imagine a young recruit, a man from a strictly orthodox background, undergoing his initiation in a remote French chapter. The ceremony proceeds, but then the presiding official asks him to perform an act that seems strange, even blasphemous. Perhaps he is told to deny Christ or to spit upon a cross. For a devout man, this would be a moment of profound crisis. Was this a true test of his absolute obedience to the order's commanders? A symbolic rejection of the physical object to prove his faith was purely spiritual? Or was it, as some terrified brothers later alleged, evidence of a hidden heretical cult operating within the Templar ranks? We may never know the full truth, but the existence of these rumors alone was catastrophic. A brother who underwent such a ritual and was deeply troubled by it would have two choices. He could bury his unease, justifying it as a test of faith, but the seed of doubt would remain. Or he could confide his fears to a trusted friend from another chapter who might be horrified by the story. This is how the poison spread. It was not a public debate, but a silent, creeping fear passed in hushed tones between brothers. The knight who questioned the ritual saw heresy. The knight who administered it saw unwavering loyalty. This internal climate of mistrust and whispered allegation created a fatal weakness. When King Philip IV of France decided to move against the order, he did not have to invent charges from whole cloth. He simply harvested the seeds of suspicion that the Templars had already sown among themselves. The very secrecy that was meant to protect them became the damning evidence used to seal their fate. Far from the political intrigues of Paris, the Templars of the Iberian Peninsula lived a different reality entirely. Their world was defined by the relentless rhythm of the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to reclaim the peninsula from its Moorish rulers, while the French core of the order debated grand crusades to the distant Holy Land. The Spanish and Portuguese brothers were fighting a very real and present war right at their doorstep. Their priorities were not shaped by abstract theology or financial theory, but by the urgent demands of local kings and the immediate threat of enemy armies. This daily reality forged a distinct identity, one of hardened pragmatism and deep integration with the Iberian kingdoms. A Templar knight stationed at a frontier castle in Portugal saw his duty not to a distant Grand Master, but to the King of Portugal who supplied his men and directed his campaigns. His loyalty was local, his mission clear, and his understanding of the Templar purpose radically different from that of a brother in a Parisian counting house. This operational independence inevitably created friction with the central leadership. The treasurer in Paris, responsible for the entire order's financial health, would receive a request from the Iberian Peninsula. It was not for funds to build a new chapel or to support pilgrims, but for a massive infusion of silver to pay for mercenaries and siege engines for a king's upcoming offensive. From the Parisian perspective, this was a drain on resources needed for the Grand Crusade, a diversion from their sacred global mission. But from the Iberian viewpoint, this was the crusade. It was the only war that mattered, the one they were actually fighting and winning. They could not understand why their brothers in France would hesitate to support a battle that was expanding Christendom right before their eyes. The tension was a classic clash between local needs and global strategy. The Iberian commanders grew to resent what they saw as the out-of-touch and overly cautious bureaucracy in Paris, while the central leadership viewed the Iberians as willful and insubordinate, too eager to please their local monarchs at the expense of the order's unity. This geographical and cultural divide exposed a critical weakness in the Templar model. How could a single Grand Master in Paris effectively command an organization whose branches faced such wildly different circumstances? The answer, increasingly, was that he could not. The Iberian Templars, backed by their grateful kings, began to operate with a level of autonomy that bordered on sovereignty. They managed their own lands, collected their own revenues, and directed their own military campaigns with only a nominal glance toward Paris. This was not a formal schism, but a de facto one, a quiet fracture along the Pyrenees Mountains. It illustrated a profound truth about global organizations, even medieval ones. Centralized control is a fragile illusion when your farthest branches are shaped by entirely different worlds, loyalties, and battlefields. The order that presented a united face to the world was, in its final years, a collection of increasingly separate entities, each pulling in a different direction, each convinced that their path was the true one. This special status became a spiritual trap. The Knights Templar were unique, answering directly to the Pope and to no king or bishop. In theory, this placed them above earthly politics, a spiritual army reporting only to God's highest representative. But in practice, this created an impossible choice for the individual brother. His first vow was absolute obedience to his Grand Master. His second was unwavering loyalty to the Holy Father. What happened when those two authorities gave conflicting commands? The order's own rule was silent on this terrible dilemma. Consider a Templar commander in a French town. He receives a direct order from Jacques de Molay in Paris to withhold a large sum of money from the royal tax collectors. The king's men, in turn, produce a papal bull, a decree from the Pope himself, demanding that all religious orders in the kingdom contribute to a special tax for a new crusade. The commander is now caught in a vice. To obey his Grand Master is to defy the Pope. To obey the Pope is to betray his sworn oath to his own order's leader. There is no right answer, only a choice between two sacred vows. This conflict of supreme loyalties forced every ranking brother to become his own pope, making a solitary judgment call that could brand him either a faithful son of the Church or a loyal Templar, but never both. This pressure was amplified by the fact that the papacy itself was often a house divided. During the bitter feud between Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip IV of France, the Templars were pulled in two directions. Their Grand Master, trying to protect the order's vast French holdings, had to tread carefully around the angry king. Yet many devout brothers within the order were spiritually outraged by the king's treatment of the Pope. They felt the order should take a stronger stand in defense of the papacy, regardless of the political cost. So you had brothers who believed their own leadership was being cowardly, placing the order's material wealth above its spiritual duty to the Church. This internal criticism further shattered morale, creating factions of pro-papal and pro-order loyalists who viewed each other with deep suspicion. The very privilege that was meant to protect them, their direct line to Rome, had become a source of paralyzing internal conflict, proving that no shield is stronger than the one that turns inward against its wielder. The island of Cyprus should have been a sanctuary, a place to regroup and heal. Instead, the air in the Great Hall was thick with accusation and despair. This was the Order's first general chapter since the catastrophic loss of Acre, a gathering meant to restore unity and purpose. It did the exact opposite. Brothers who had fought side by side for years now stood in hostile factions, their shared trauma curdling into mutual blame. The most urgent and divisive question was who would lead them out of this ruin. The election for the new Grand Master was not a solemn affair of prayer and reflection. It was a brutal political battle, a raw struggle for the soul of the Templars. The French party, still the largest and most influential, pushed for a candidate who would pledge to launch an immediate new crusade, to reclaim their lost glory at any cost. But other voices from England, from Spain, from Italy saw this as madness. They argued for a leader who would prioritize the Order's survival in Europe, who would fortify their financial and political positions rather than gamble everything on another doomed military adventure. The debates grew so heated that reports from the time described shouting matches, with brothers openly accusing each other of corruption and betrayal. Some whispered that votes were being brokered, that promises of land and titles were exchanged in shadowy corners to secure support. The fundamental rift was no longer philosophical. It was a naked power struggle between regional blocs, each convinced that the other's vision would lead to annihilation. The conclave on Cyprus, intended to be a council of recovery, nearly became the scene of the Order's spontaneous self-destruction. It revealed a terrifying truth. The Templars were no longer a unified army. They were a collection of frightened, warring tribes trapped on an island with the ghost of their own failed purpose. Into this fractured brotherhood stepped a king who saw not a sacred order, but a business partner who had outlived his usefulness. King Philip IV of France was a man drowning in debt, and the Templars were his most demanding creditors. He did not need to break down their gates with an army when he could simply pick the lock from the inside. Philip's true genius lay in his understanding of the Templars' internal weaknesses. He knew of the resentment between the warriors and the treasurers, the schism between the crusading idealists and the European pragmatists. He began to systematically exploit these cracks. His agents identified Templar officials who were ambitious, or perhaps simply frustrated with the Order's direction. To these men, the king offered a tempting alternative. He dangled the prospect of royal favor, promising lands, titles, and positions of influence within the French court if they would subtly align their decisions with the crown's interests. For a brother who felt his loyalty to the order was going unrewarded, this was an irresistible offer. Simultaneously, Philip wielded the stick of royal disfavor. A Templar preceptor who refused to cooperate might suddenly find his chapter's lands subject to new royal taxes, or his supply lines for materials mysteriously delayed by royal officials. This carrot-and-stick approach was devastatingly effective. It created a pro-French clique within the order's highest ranks, a fifth column that reported to the king and worked to steer Templar policy in a direction that benefited the French crown. Imagine a meeting of the Templar leadership in Paris. A respected commander, secretly in the king's pocket, would argue against lending money to the English king, citing the risk. His true motive, however, was to weaken France's rival. Another would advocate for selling a strategically located preceptory, claiming it was a financial drain, while knowing the buyer was a noble loyal to Philip. This internal manipulation amplified every existing division. The debate over funding a new crusade was no longer just a philosophical split. It was now a proxy war, with the pro-French faction arguing to hoard resources in France, effectively placing the order's wealth under the king's shadow. The traditionalists who demanded a new holy war were unwittingly playing into Philip's hands, for their militant stance made the Templars look more dangerous and independent to the king's allies. The order's internal conflicts were no longer just their own. They had become channels for a foreign power's agenda, and the king was slowly turning the Templars' own brothers into the instruments of their ruin. Trust was the first casualty in this silent war. In the final years before their downfall, a new and insidious rule took hold inside Templar preceptories. Brothers were no longer just soldiers or monks, they were now potential informants. An atmosphere of quiet dread settled over the communal halls, where a whispered conversation between two friends could be misconstrued as conspiracy, and a moment of private doubt could be reported as heresy. This system of internal surveillance did not need official enforcers. It worked by turning every man into a watchman over his brother. Imagine sitting at the common meal, the same meal you had shared with these men for years. The brother beside you mentions his confusion over a strange command from a visiting dignitary. Do you nod in silent agreement, or do you later report his questioning attitude to the preceptor just to be safe? This was the poison at work. It encouraged a form of spiritual betrayal where the duty to the order was twisted into a duty to spy. The very bonds of brotherhood forged in shared sacrifice were systematically dismantled. There is a powerful historical concept called a panopticon, a prison designed so that a single guard could watch all prisoners without them knowing if they were being observed at any given moment. The result is that the prisoners begin to police their own behavior constantly, just in case. The Templar preceptories became medieval panopticons. A brother never knew if the man praying next to him was a true companion or a secret informant noting his every gesture. This pervasive suspicion made organized defense against outside threats impossible. How could you plan a unified response to growing royal pressure when you could not trust the brother in the next cell? The order was paralyzed from within, its unity replaced by 1,000 individual fears. This climate did not emerge from a vacuum. It is highly likely that King Philip's agents, having already infiltrated the upper ranks, actively encouraged this culture of denunciation. By promoting paranoia and rewarding accusations, they ensured the Templars would be too busy watching each other to see the king's net closing around them all. The real tragedy is that when the royal officials finally came knocking at dawn on that infamous Friday the 13th, many Templars may have felt a grim sense of inevitability. The walls had already been breached long before, not by battering rams but by whispers. That archive was more than a library, it was the Order's silent, beating heart. Deep within the temple complex in Paris lay a chamber few brothers ever entered, a fortress of knowledge containing the true history of the Templars. Here were not just financial ledgers but secret agreements with kings, detailed maps of forgotten trade routes, and private correspondence that could topple thrones. Control over this trove was the ultimate source of influence, and a final, explosive fault line in the Order's fractured structure. For the inner circle of the Grand Master, this archive was a strategic weapon. They argued that such dangerous knowledge had to be tightly held, that loose lips could sink their entire enterprise. They saw full transparency as an existential threat. But for the broader membership, this secrecy bred a deep and corrosive paranoia. A regional commander tasked with managing a critical border region might be denied access to treaties that directly impacted his own security. How could he negotiate with a local bishop or baron if he did not know what promises his own order had already made? This created a dangerous ignorance where brothers were operating in the dark, making decisions based on incomplete information and potentially undermining years of delicate diplomacy. The disputes were not merely about access, but about the very soul of their recorded history. Imagine a fierce debate in the final years. The militant faction, led by Jacques de Molay, may have advocated for the destruction of certain documents, particularly those detailing the pragmatic, and some would say compromising, alliances forged by his predecessor. To de Molay, these records were evidence of a straying from their pure crusading path, a spiritual embarrassment that needed to be erased. But the administrators, the men who understood the power of a signed contract and the value of institutional memory, would have fought this fiercely. For them, destroying a treaty was not just burning parchment, it was incinerating leverage, obliterating the legal and political foundations that protected the Order's vast holdings. This was a conflict over the Templars' own identity, fought with ink and flame. Would they be the pure, militant order of de Molay's imagination, or the complex, politically engaged institution documented in their own archives? The struggle to control the narrative, to decide what was remembered and what was forgotten, revealed a brotherhood at war with its own past, desperately trying to curate a legacy that was already slipping from its grasp. While the land-based commanders debated grand strategy, the sea was a different world entirely. The Templar Fleet was the Order's vital artery, a collection of war galleys and transport ships that moved soldiers, silver, and supplies across the treacherous Mediterranean. But the captains who commanded these vessels answered to a rhythm set by the wind and tide, not by the slow-turning wheels of bureaucracy in Paris. This maritime branch developed its own fierce culture, one of practical seamanship and split-second decisions, and it often put them on a collision course with their own leadership. A fleet commander stationed on Cyprus received his primary orders from the Grand Master, but his daily reality was dictated by the need to keep his ships seaworthy, his sailors paid, and his cargoes safe from pirates and rival navies. When a desperate plea for reinforcements arrived from a coastal fortress, he did not have time to send a letter to Paris and wait months for a reply. He had to act, committing his ships and men based on the situation before him. This necessary autonomy was a constant source of tension. The treasurer in London, for instance, might see a line item for the urgent repair of 3 war galleys and question the expense, demanding a full written justification. To the sea captain, such a delay was not just frustrating, it was a potential death sentence for the men who depended on those ships. He saw the land-based administrators as pen pushers who had no concept of the rot that could eat a hull or the storm that could sink a fleet. The conflict was a clash of necessities. The land commanders needed to control resources for their overarching plans, but the Navy needed the freedom to spend those resources to survive in a volatile environment. This rift represented a fundamental division of labor and perspective. How could a man who had never felt a deck roll beneath his feet truly understand the demands of commanding a fleet? The sea, which connected the far-flung Templar holdings, ironically became another channel of internal discord, proving that even an order built on unity could be divided by the very element that held it together. Even the sacred process of choosing a leader could not escape the order's deep fractures. The election of a Grand Master was enshrined in ritual, a solemn gathering meant to be guided by prayer and divine will. Yet in those final, desperate years, it transformed into something else entirely. It became a raw political contest, a stage where every regional rivalry and ideological schism played out in the open. Factions did not simply pray for the best man to win. They actively lobbied, bargained, and campaigned. A commander from France would quietly promise support to a Spanish official in exchange for control over a lucrative preceptory. An Italian treasurer might pledge his chapter's votes to an English candidate, hoping for a greater voice in financial policy. The spiritual quest for a leader was corrupted into a marketplace of influence where sacred vows were weighed against political debts. The election that brought Jacques de Molay to power was almost certainly a product of this brutal backroom dealing. He was the champion of the militant old guard, and his victory was a triumph for the knights who still dreamed of crusade. But what kind of victory was it? He ascended to the highest office not as a unifying figure, but as the representative of one victorious faction in a cold civil war. From his very first day, a significant portion of his own order viewed him with skepticism, if not outright hostility. The administrators, the naval commanders, the Iberian brothers, all saw in de Molay a man whose vision threatened their own understanding of the Templar future. He was a king whose subjects were already in rebellion, a general whose army was riddled with soldiers who questioned his every command. How can you lead when a fundamental part of your brotherhood believes your core mission is a path to ruin? This was the impossible legacy of a corrupted election, a leadership born from division, destined to rule over a house divided against itself. A quiet rebellion was already underway long before the king's soldiers arrived. This was not a clash of swords in the courtyard, but a slow, deliberate grinding to a halt within the order's own machinery. The most powerful form of dissent was not shouted in chapter meetings, but whispered in the ledger books and enacted through deliberate delay. A treasurer in London, frustrated with Grand Master de Molay's relentless demand for crusade funds, might suddenly find his accounting work plagued by inexplicable complications. A request for a financial transfer to Paris would be held up for weeks, buried under a mountain of unnecessary paperwork, or lost due to a clerk's persistent errors. Vital supplies destined for the coast would be misrouted, their waybills mysteriously incorrect, arriving too late to meet the fleet. These were not acts of treason that could be easily punished. They were the silent protests of men who felt their expertise and concerns were being ignored, a bureaucratic insurgency fought with parchment and ink. The most dangerous weapon was often a deliberately slow walk. Information, the lifeblood of any large organization, began to leak. A local preceptor, sympathetic to the concerns of his regional king, might quietly share the contents of a confidential order from Paris with a friendly royal official, giving the crown a crucial advantage in negotiations. This was not betrayal in the eyes of the leaker, but a necessary correction, a way to counterbalance what he saw as the disastrous policies of his own leadership. He was being loyal to what he believed was the true purpose of the Templars, even if it meant circumventing its commander. How do you maintain discipline when obedience itself becomes a matter of personal interpretation? The iron chain of command, once the order's greatest strength, was now rusted with mistrust and quiet defiance. Each small act of disobedience was a symptom of a profound spiritual sickness, a brotherhood where the shared cause had splintered into 100 conflicting personal convictions. Far from the king's prisons, a different kind of Templar story was quietly unfolding. While the order in France was being systematically dismantled, a persistent legend claims that a faction of brothers found an unlikely sanctuary in the wild, misty hills of Scotland. This was not an official relocation, but a potential flight of dissidents, men who could no longer stomach the political compromises and internal corruption they saw consuming their leadership. For these brothers, the only way to remain faithful to their original warrior ideals was to physically abandon the very institution that had once defined them. The timing is what makes this theory so compelling. The Templars' suppression began in 1307. Just 7 years later, in 1314, the Scottish king Robert the Bruce faced the English army at the decisive Battle of Bannockburn. Contemporary chronicles describe the Bruce's army as outnumbered and exhausted. Yet at a critical moment in the fighting, a fresh, unknown reserve force appeared on the high ground, turning the tide of the battle and securing Scottish independence. Who were these mysterious, disciplined fighters? Legends insist they were the fugitive Templars, applying their elite military training to a new cause. Think of the powerful symbolism here. The very order being hunted to extinction in France may have delivered a kingdom-saving victory on a Scottish battlefield. This was not just a change of location, it was a complete transformation of purpose. These were no longer the defenders of pilgrims to Jerusalem, but the protectors of a nation's freedom. Their new oath was not to a distant pope or a compromising Grand Master, but to a warrior king who shared their fight for survival. The appeal for a disillusioned Templar would have been profound. In Scotland, he would not be ordered to deny his faith in a secret ritual or to bow to a greedy king. He could live as a simple warrior monk, his sword pledged to a tangible, just cause. The Scottish Church, often at odds with the papacy, might have offered a safe harbor, turning a blind eye to the papal orders for their arrest. This theory paints a picture of a silent schism, not of doctrine, but of geography and loyalty. It suggests that the Templar spirit did not die in the flames of Paris, but instead went underground, finding a new expression in the struggle of an emerging nation. The true rebellion within the order, then, may have had a final, dramatic act, not in a council chamber, but on a bloody field in Scotland, where brothers who had escaped the king's net fought one last time to redefine what it meant to be a knight. Even the sacred vow of brotherhood could not silence the sound of a native tongue. Latin bound them together in prayer and official decree, a universal language for a universal order. But outside the chapel, the halls of a Templar preceptory echoed with a chorus of different voices. A knight from England would converse in his Anglo-Norman French, while a sergeant from Aragon might speak a dialect of Catalan, and a German brother relied on his native tongue. This linguistic reality created invisible walls within their own fortresses. The official business of the order was conducted in French, a legacy of its founding. This meant that the path to power, to a seat on the Grand Chapter or a commandery in France, was paved with a specific linguistic and cultural fluency. A highly capable English commander, brilliant in strategy but less comfortable in Parisian French, would find his influence limited. He would watch as less experienced French brothers were promoted into the inner circle, not necessarily through conspiracy, but through the simple, unspoken advantage of shared language and culture. Can you feel the resentment building over decades? An Italian treasurer managing complex finances for the entire province has to present his reports in a language that is not his own. A single misunderstood term in a financial document could have massive consequences, making him appear less competent in the eyes of the French-dominated Central Command. This was not just about words, it was about trust, about the subtle nuances of a joke, the shared cultural references that build deep bonds. The French brothers, often unintentionally, formed a tight-knit group, their easy communication seen from the outside as exclusionary favoritism. The non-French Templars, in turn, gravitated towards their own countrymen, creating national cliques for mutual support and understanding. The English brothers in London, the Iberians in Valencia, the Germans in their Rhineland preceptories, they all began to develop their own distinct identities, united by a common language and a shared sense of being on the outside of the true centers of power. The grand ideal of a borderless brotherhood was cracking under the weight of its own multinational reality, proving that sometimes the most powerful divisions are not written in any rulebook, but spoken in the common language of everyday life. A Templar in Paris might spend his day in a vaulted counting house, surrounded by the rustle of parchment and the murmur of foreign merchants. His world was one of complex loans, royal debts, and high-stakes diplomacy. He wore the white mantle, but his hands were more accustomed to handling a wax seal than a sword hilt. His understanding of the rule was shaped by this reality. The vow of poverty meant the order held collective wealth, not that it lived in destitution. Obedience meant navigating the treacherous currents of court politics to protect that wealth. For him, the Templar mission was a global enterprise, and its survival depended on financial and political acumen. 100 leagues away, in a rural commandery in the French countryside, his brother's experience was entirely different. That Templar's view from the battlements was not of a crowded city street, but of endless fields and quiet forests. His daily rhythm was set by the harvest, the health of the livestock, and the management of tenant farmers. His interaction with the outside world was limited to the local village and the occasional traveling priest. For him, the vow of poverty was a tangible reality of simple meals and a hard bed. Obedience meant following the agricultural calendar and ensuring his commandery was self-sufficient. He saw the order's purpose not in balance sheets, but in the bread it could provide to the hungry and the security it offered to the surrounding lands. This was not a minor difference in lifestyle, it was a chasm of perception. The urban brother, required to send a portion of his chapter's earnings to support a rural house, might see it as subsidizing a backward and unproductive outpost. Why should the profits from his sophisticated banking operations be sent to men who did little more than farm? The rural brother, ordered to forward the bulk of his harvest surplus to Paris, would seethe with resentment. He saw his hard-won grain and wool being shipped off to feed a distant bureaucracy that contributed nothing to the land. Each saw the other as failing to uphold the true spirit of the order. The urban Templar viewed his rural brother as a simpleton, disconnected from the real sources of power. The rural Templar saw his urban counterpart as a corrupt merchant who had lost his way, trading his soul for a ledger book. How could these two men, sworn to the same brotherhood, possibly understand each other's world? This cultural rift meant the order was not just divided by ideology or geography, but by the very ground beneath their feet. The shadow of the Albigensian Crusade stretched long over the Templar order. In the sun-baked hills of the Languedoc, where the Cathar heresy had taken root, the order maintained a significant presence. They were landlords and protectors of the local populace, a role that required a certain degree of cooperation. This proximity bred suspicion. Rumors swirled that some Templar brothers, living alongside the Cathar perfecti, had engaged in more than just pragmatic diplomacy. Whispers spoke of secret dialogues and a dangerous intellectual curiosity about the Cathar belief in a world where the physical was evil and the spiritual was pure. How could a warrior monk sworn to defend the material church remain untouched by such radical ideas. This was not a proven conspiracy, but a pervasive atmosphere of guilt by association. Within the order itself, this lingering suspicion became a potent political weapon. A commander from northern France, locked in a dispute with a rival from a southern preceptory, could subtly invoke the taint of heresy. He might question his opponent's doctrinal rigidity, hinting that his long service in the Languedoc had softened his orthodoxy. It was an accusation nearly impossible to refute, a stain that required no evidence, only a well-placed whisper in the right ear. This internal weaponization of doubt further corrupted the Brotherhood's spirit, turning the complex reality of their operations in a troubled region into a ready-made cudgel for internal power struggles. The very ambiguity of their past actions had left them vulnerable to attack from within, proving that in a house divided, even a ghost from a forgotten war can be summoned to haunt the living. The testimony of Raimbord de Caron echoes through the centuries as a perfect storm of personal grievance and external pressure. This respected knight, a man who had commanded Templar houses, chose to stand before the Papal Commission and speak in damning detail against his own brothers. He described secret initiation rites filled with sacrilege, of being told to deny Christ and spit upon the cross. His words were not vague rumors, they were a precise first-hand account that gave the prosecution its most powerful weapon. So why would a man of his standing break his sacred vows? The motivations of Raimbord de Caron reveal the final, tragic unraveling of the Templar spirit. Fear was certainly a factor. Held in the king's prisons, he knew the fate that awaited those who refused to cooperate. Torture was a very real and terrifying prospect. Yet his testimony feels too detailed, too specific to be born solely from pain. Perhaps it was rooted in a deeper, more personal sense of betrayal. Imagine a knight like de Caron, who had dedicated his life to the Order's original warrior ideals, witnessing its transformation into a vast financial empire. He may have seen the rise of the administrator brothers, the political compromises, and the strange new rituals as a profound corruption of everything he held sacred. His testimony, then, might not have been a simple lie to save his skin, but a twisted act of purging. He could have genuinely believed the Order had lost its way, and that by confessing to its sins, he was forcing a divine judgment upon it. His damning words became the ultimate expression of the internal rebellion, a final, public airing of the grievances that had festered in private for decades. King Philip's officials did not need to invent a heretic. They simply needed to find a disillusioned brother and offer him a path, however grim, to settle an old score. In the broken figure of Raimbord de Caron, the cold civil war within the Templars finally found its most devastating voice, proving that the most effective weapon against a fortress is a soldier who has already lost faith in its walls. Their final chapter meetings were held behind locked doors, in halls that once echoed with shared purpose, but now resonated with a tense and brittle silence. Senior officials who had not spoken civilly in years gathered around heavy oak tables, their faces etched with the grim knowledge that the Order was teetering on the brink. This was their last, desperate attempt at reconciliation, a final effort to paper over the cracks before the entire structure collapsed. The debates were no longer about grand strategy, but about pure survival. One faction, led by the most pragmatic administrators, begged for a radical public gesture. They proposed voluntarily opening their financial records to a papal commission to prove their transparency and disarm the rumors of corruption swirling around them. They argued that only by fully embracing their role as bankers and servants of the Church could they survive in this new, treacherous political climate. But the old guard knights, their identities forged in battle, recoiled at the idea. To them, such a move was the ultimate surrender, a humiliating admission that they were mere moneylenders. They believed their strength still lay in their martial reputation and their sacred vows, and that any show of weakness would only invite the attack they all feared. Imagine the frustration in that room. A treasurer from England with detailed ledgers spread before him could prove the order's solvency, but he could not prove its unity. A grizzled commander from Cyprus could outline a dozen defensive strategies, but he could not command the trust of his own brothers in Paris. Every practical proposal was met with suspicion, viewed not on its own merits, but through the lens of which faction had proposed it. Years of bureaucratic infighting and regional rivalries had so poisoned the well that even the most obvious steps for self-preservation became subjects of bitter dispute. The very mistrust they were trying to combat had already wormed its way into the heart of their council chambers, ensuring that every attempt to present a united front was stillborn. Their final meetings did not end with a plan, but with a resigned and weary adjournment. They left those rooms not as a unified army ready to face its accusers, but as the same collection of wary, divided men who had entered. The last chance for reconciliation had slipped through their fingers, a silent failure that would echo far louder than any of their past victories. Their famous secrecy became their greatest vulnerability. In a brotherhood where trust had fractured, confidential information was no longer a sacred trust, but a weapon to be wielded in internal disputes. A commander who opposed the Grand Master's crusading plans might deliberately leak details of its immense cost to a friendly bishop, hoping the resulting outcry would force a change in policy. An administrator, angry at the influence of the warrior faction, could subtly reveal the strange particulars of an initiation right to a scribe known to have the king's ear, planting the seeds of future accusations. This was not treason as they would have once defined it, for each man believed his leak was a necessary act to save the order from itself. The very protocols designed to protect them were now turned inward, used to sabotage rival factions. How could any strategic plan remain secret when the brothers in the next chamber saw that plan as a threat to their own vision for the order's future? The sanctity of their chapter meetings evaporated. A decision made in a locked room in Paris would be known in London or Aragon within weeks, not through official channels but through the whispered networks of dissent. This hemorrhage of secrets meant the Templars were broadcasting their weaknesses to the outside world. King Philip did not need a master spy. He only needed to listen to the cacophony of a brotherhood tearing itself apart. The walls meant to keep their enemies out were now transparent from within. Every confidential document and every private ritual potentially just one disgruntled brother away from becoming public knowledge. A brother could no longer find solace in the common hall. The shared meals, once a time for camaraderie and storytelling, became exercises in silent observation. Every glance held a potential accusation, every quiet conversation between two brothers a possible conspiracy. The psychological burden of this constant, low-grade suspicion was a poison seeping into their daily lives. A knight who had once trusted his life to the man fighting beside him now wondered if that same man would report a careless comment about the Grand Master's latest directive. This was a unique form of torment, a spiritual fatigue that no amount of prayer could fully alleviate. The Order's foundational promise was brotherhood, a sacred bond stronger than blood. To feel that bond fraying from the inside created a profound sense of isolation, even when surrounded by hundreds of fellow knights. How do you maintain your faith in a sacred institution when the institution itself seems to have lost faith in its own members? The strain manifested in subtle but telling ways. Brothers became more reserved, less likely to share their doubts or spiritual struggles for fear of being misunderstood. Initiative waned as acting independently could be seen as insubordination. while strict obedience might align you with a faction you privately opposed. This internal paralysis was as damaging as any military defeat. An external enemy you could fight with a sword, but how do you fight an enemy that has no face, an atmosphere of mistrust that you are, perhaps, even helping to create with your own silence? The very qualities that made a good Templar, loyalty and obedience, were now the sources of their deepest anxiety. The order was not just risking its political unity, it was slowly dismantling the human spirit of every brother who had pledged it his life. The Templars did not fall because of their internal divisions, but they fell because of them. A united order, bound by the iron discipline of its founding, might have withstood the king's assault. It could have presented a formidable legal defense, leveraged its international network for political support, and faced the accusations with a single, unbreakable voice. But the order that faced King Philip was a ghost of its former self. Its leadership was compromised by French loyalists, its ranks were demoralized by years of suspicion, and its command structure was paralyzed by factional infighting. When the crisis came, there was no one to lead a coordinated counterattack. The legal defense was haphazard and slow, hampered by brothers who had lost faith in their own commanders. The political outreach to other monarchs was undermined by regional branches that had long operated with their own agendas. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was a leader to only one part of his own order, a general whose authority was already questioned by a significant portion of his own army. They were not a fortress whose walls were breached by a single mighty blow. They were a structure so weakened by internal dry rot that it collapsed under the first strong wind. The true tragedy is that their greatest enemy was not the king who destroyed them, but the slow, silent rebellion that had already hollowed them out from within.